This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional life that you're happy with. On this episode, I speak with Schabram, Assistant Professor of Management at the Foster School of Business. I wanted to talk to Kira because of her research into kindness, compassion, and meaningful work, or callings, and burnout. All topics that interest me and relate to the work that I do with many of my MBA students at the Foster School. We spoke in August of 2021 during the COVID pandemic, and the topics we discussed continue to be relevant today. Kira, welcome to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your work studies the challenges faced by employees who want to make the world a better place, as I read in one of your bios in the Harvard Business Review. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the podcast. Increasingly, I've just met with 40 of our incoming students in the MBA class of 2023. Increasingly, over the 5 or 6 years that I've been doing this, I've been hearing students say that they're coming to get their MBA because they want to have an impact on the world. And some variation of that, making the world a better place. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about how your research has provided perhaps insights for the kind of students that we work with at the Foster School who want to go into an impact which maybe is around sustainability, energy, packaging, consumer goods, etc., and not like in the direct social service sense of impact.
Yeah, I'd love to. So perhaps I should start talking a little bit about what I study in terms of when you say make the world a better place.
Yeah.
So in my research, I am interested in employees who view work as a calling. And I should be very clear that that doesn't have to have a religious connotation. What we mean academically by a calling is work that has a personal, social, and or moral impact in the world. And so for me, broadly speaking, that's making the world a better place, either through social service professions, as you said, but that could also be through perfecting a craft if you are an artist, or just through being a better leader, right? So to helping your subordinates. And so what research suggests is that we're seeing an increasing number of employees, especially among millennials and Gen Z, who are interested in this. And so I'm not surprised that we're getting more of those applicants. What I am interested in studying is how you can make that work sustainable. Because what we've realized over the last 20 years is that work as a calling, meaningful work, is very much a double-edged sword. It can give you the highest highs and the lowest lows. So there's a lot of passion, engagement, commitment that comes from being passionate about work, finding meaningful work. But it also makes you more prone to burnout. It can lead to more conflict with coworkers. The expression I like to use a lot with my students is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That once you realize, here's what I want to do in the world, it can make it a lot harder for you. So my research looks at how do you do that work sustainably without flaming out, without picking a fight with your coworkers.
And what have you found? What's the secret?
Sure.
Please tell us.
So there's a couple of best practices that we are starting to uncover. The first is that we notice there's a big difference between discovering your calling, so discovering what you consider as meaningful in the world, and then actually living that. So number one, what we find is if you've decided, my calling is X. For simplicity, let me say you're really passionate about music and you want to become a musician, or you're really passionate about sports, you want to go into sports management, or as you mentioned, the environment. If you cannot actually break into that field, it can lead to a life of heartbreak and disappointment. What we find is that once people discover their calling, they're very unreceptive to negative feedback. So there's studies of musicians that they're constantly getting feedback that there's no jobs here, or unfortunately, you just don't have the talent. They don't want to hear that. And so it becomes really frustrating. So number one is once you've discovered your calling, figuring out a way to actually find work that aligns with that. And so having resources, accessing resources here at Foster, how do you get into those industries? How can I get an internship? It's really important that once you discover a calling, you figure out how to get into those fields. That may not always be the most direct route. And so we often find well, my calling is music or my calling is the environment. So the only jobs I'm willing to accept are jobs that fit that specifically. Be a little bit more flexible early on, right? Can you come in through a side door? Can you intern with a different organization, learn those skills, make yourself more marketable? So that would be my first advice is don't get frustrated because you can't get into the profession.
That's great. I have a guest on two guests on one episode that's out already and one that probably will be out by the time this one comes out, who have moved into post MBA roles that are in sustainability, one in a finance role and the other in more of a strategy kind of role. And they took sort of two different tacks. One held out for like, I'm going to keep on moving in this direction directly. And the other was like, I'm going to take this finance role at this company and I am going to tell everyone that I want to be in sustainability finance. And, 18 months later, she's in sustainability finance. So right. I'll link those two episodes in the show notes. It's Austin Morton and Rachel Hester are those two episodes. So listeners can look for the differences in their two stories.
I highly encourage that. And as you noticed, that doesn't mean that you put your dream on hold, if you will, right? You can still mention what you're interested in, slowly work your way over while you're taking that initial position that may not perfectly fit you. So basically what we find is that when you consider work meaningful, when you've discovered a calling, it tends to put blinders on you. You tend to have a very specific expectation of what that looks like. So being a little bit more open-minded, being more flexible is something that can help prevent the frustration that we find with a lot of people who just keep trying to knock on that front door. So that would be my first recommendation. My second recommendation is, I'll tell you about a study that we did with animal shelter employees, and I think it applies broadly to other employees. We just went with an extreme sample where a lot of people have this calling, right? And so when we started that study, we wondered, animal shelter work is really difficult. You want to save animals, but you have to euthanize them. You have very few resources. There's a lot of legislative constraints. Who is able to make it in that profession over time? Because it has a very high turnover rate. What we thought is that the people with the strongest sense of calling, the people who from a young age thought, I want to save animals, or if we want to now go back to environmentalism, I want to help the planet during this climate crisis. Or if you're a musician, music is my calling. We thought it takes that level of passion in order to make the work sustainable. What we found is the exact opposite. What we found is when you have that strong of a sense of calling, again, it kind of puts blinders on you and the work can really break you. Every little frustration that you encounter, you take personal because it's so important to you. You tend to see other employees as not caring as much as you. So you can't empathize as well that they're also going through these strains. And so when we looked at who's succeeded in those professions over time, who 20 years later is in leadership roles, has passed new laws, is in really high governmental positions to help the animal welfare movement, it's the people who came in with much smaller expectations. We called them practitioner or on a practitioner path. So they liked animals, they cared about animals, but they were open to learning how the field works. They were open to working with other people. And so they slowly moved their way up. They never get so frustrated that they burn out or that they pick a massive fight. And so temperance seems to be really important. There's such a thing as too much passion. And I realize that sounds counterintuitive, but the people who make it are the people who have not as strong of a fire burning in them, who are willing to go home at the end of the day. They have other hobbies outside of what they perceive their calling, and they just slowly make it work for them over time.
That's interesting. Especially the having something outside of work, essentially.
Yep.
The other hobby. So maybe it's the animal welfare is a passion, but then maybe music's your other passion, and you go home and you play music with friends and family.
I remember I did an interview with a firefighter, and let me be clear again that we interview or we do studies with professions where we expect a high level of calling, but we find it in all industries. So I'm just using these as examples. And they talked about how they have a little boat. At the end of the day, they go and they sit on the lake on their little boat and they go fishing or they do something else. You need something else. You can't just have this thing that you're passionate about that's on 24/7.
So it sounds like a good piece of advice for anyone is to recharge your batteries, so to speak, at the end of a work day or at the end of a work week by doing something that is different from the thing that calls you to work every day.
100%. And that's not just specifically to people who view work as a calling. If you want to talk about my research on burnout, what we find is one of the best things you can do for yourself is have other activities that allow you to recharge your battery.
Let's talk about burnout. I think we throw the word around a lot, but recently I know it was actually defined right in the DSM-5 and has been recognized by the WHO as essentially another silent epidemic in the world. How do you define clinical burnout?
So there's a very common misperception about burnout that equates it with exhaustion and only exhaustion. So there's this belief that burnout means I'm exhausted. Clinically, burnout actually has 3 dimensions or 3 symptoms, and you have to have some sort of combination of the 3. Exhaustion is absolutely one of them. So waking up in the morning and you're already tired. It's not just exhaustion, though. Exhaustion is a symptom of lots of other clinical diagnoses, right? The other 2 that are more unique to burnout are, number 1, a feeling of inefficacy. Things that used to come easy to you no longer do, or you're just having a difficulty accomplishing tasks. The third one is cynicism. Cynicism is a feeling of remove or alienation, either from others around you at work or the work itself. So early studies of burnout were primarily done in the healthcare sector, and so they looked at distancing yourself from your clients or your patients, no longer being able to relate to them. We have since, over the last 40 years of studying burnout, found that that can really also be distancing from coworkers or distancing yourself from the work, kind of thinking, what's the point of any of these? And so burnout tends to be a combination of those 3. There are a couple of dominant profiles that we tend to see more often than others. One example would be we often find that burnout starts with exhaustion. It's kind of the canary in the coal mine. You're finding yourself being more exhausted and more tired. Because of that, you're getting less done. So inefficacy creeps in. And because of that, you start to feel cynical. So it's kind of the slippery slope where they build upon each other.
And you've written that when individuals suffer from burnout, many feel too overwhelmed to participate meaningfully in wellness initiatives. So like one of the things that we try and do at the university and that I know a lot of companies try and do is they have these big wellness initiatives. Oh, we're going to have lunchtime yoga or we're going to have meditation. I mean, I ran meditation sessions, mindfulness sessions. So if people who are experiencing burnout are less likely to engage in those activities or even benefit from them if they do engage, what are some of the ways that an individual can pull themselves out of it?
So that's a big conundrum in burnout research. If you talk to some of the biggest burnout scholars out there, Christine Maslach at Berkeley, the big question is, okay, you have burnout. What do we do about it? What we have tried to study over the last 20 years and what organizations have tried to do is what interventions work. What kind of wellness initiative can we organize that will help our employees? And those have found very mixed results. The research that we've done here at Foster, myself with our PhD student, Yutse Heng, is we've looked at if these interventions that other people organize for you don't work, how much can you do for yourself? So we took an agentic approach to burnout. We said, is there anything you can do to pull yourself out of your own burnout? And what we found is, yeah, it turns out that if you take agency, you have a much better chance of pulling yourself out of burnout than when other people impose a wellness initiative for you, because it's probably not as well tailored. And so I want to be clear that my argument isn't, hey, it's your job to pull yourself out of your own burnout and to kind of say the organization doesn't have to do anything. It's the organization's job to prevent your burnout in the first place. They really should focus on that. What we're suggesting is that once you are burning out, treating your own symptoms can be really effective. So we did one study with Foster students over the midterm period, right? The most stressful period of the term. It's those 2 weeks where what we're finding a lot of acute burnout. So in the moment experience of exhaustion, inefficacy, and cynicism. And what we found is that very small acts of compassion, of taking care of people, helped pull you out of that burnout. The caveat is, though, that the compassion has to match the burnout. If you are feeling exhausted, if that's your primary symptom, self-care is the way to go. And so all these things we've heard about self-care over the last couple of years, right? take a night off or go exercise or take a nap absolutely work, but they only work for exhaustion. So if you are exhausted, you absolutely have my permission to go and take a nap. We found even taking a 15-minute nap reduced your next day burnout. The problem is if you are experiencing cynicism, if you're thinking, what's the point of all this? Why am I in this major? Do I even still want to get an MBA? Those kinds of self-care activities are the opposite of what you want to do, because now you're isolating yourself further. You're kind of just spending time by yourself in your room. And so what we found is that when your burnout symptom is primarily cynicism, doing nice things for other people is what helped. So rather than us as a school organizing wellness opportunities, a mentorship program would be a really good way to help with that. Giving you someone else that you can give advice to or that you can support pulls you out of that cynicism because it makes you aware again of what difference you're making. And then the last one, inefficacy. Here's the good news. If you're feeling inefficacious, both worked. So when we had students do acts of self-care, hey, go to the gym for 10 minutes, cook a nice meal, or when we had them do compassion, do something nice for someone else, both of those made people feel, wow, I am accomplishing something, and it helped reduce next day burnout. So in short, what our research shows is, and this is very specific to students, but we think it generalizes to employees, is that figure out what symptoms of burnout you are experiencing. If it's exhaustion, take care of yourself. If it's cynicism, take care of others. If it's inefficacy, either one works. Do what suits you.
Well, I'm going to come back to the actions or the interventions, but let's come back to the diagnosis. How does someone know that they are feeling burnout, and then how do they identify which factors are the most significant for them? Is there a diagnostic rubric? Is it something that someone close to them can help them identify? What's the deal with that?
So there are diagnostic rubrics. Burnout is actually one of the most established constructs that we have in the fields of IO psychology and OB. We've been studying this for about 40 years. The most commonly used one by employers is called the Maslach Burnout Inventory. And there's actually a lot of customized versions of that. There's the Maslach Burnout Inventory for healthcare workers, for students. So popping onto that website and taking that survey would be an easy way to do it if you want to go the clinical diagnosis route. If you're a lay person and you're just thinking about this, I think sitting down and thinking about, am I exhausted? Am I feeling inefficacious? Or am I feeling cynical? These are lay constructs that you can think about. What's really going on in my life? And so, yes, there are diagnostic tools, but if you don't have them, I think some critical self-evaluation. I can speak from my own perspective. I've certainly felt burnout over the last year. There's COVID, which we're all going through. I also have a baby at home. It is very clear to me on days where I'm exhausted versus where I'm feeling cynical, right? You start to have an awareness once you understand that these are the 3 symptoms you should be looking out for.
So there's that's almost a mindfulness component of just identifying, being in touch with your feelings. Like, what is it that I'm feeling today? And what is it that I might need today? Yeah,
we actually included mindfulness in our studies of exactly these phenomena, right, of burnout and compassion. I will give you a slightly less optimistic note. What we find is that when people are already experiencing burnout, which is very common, we think about 70% plus of employees report burnout, the mindfulness goes way down. So what we found is it's actually really difficult for people experiencing burnout to follow the advice that I'm currently giving you, to be mindful of your symptoms and then do something about it. It's hard to kickstart that process. If you can give yourself a push to do it, there are great benefits, but I'm not saying it's easy, and we find that the majority of respondents don't.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like a true Yossarian catch-22 where, you've got to be crazy to keep flying, and if you're crazy, they won't let you fly, right?
And that could be the role of organizations, right? So perhaps the role of organizations is moving away from these very well customized, designed interventions and instead just giving resources for employees to diagnose themselves and do something about it. But yeah, we find that it's really hard to make the jump from, okay, I'm burnt out, let me do something about it.
Yeah. So small acts, right? Helping someone out.
Yep.
Like even the 5-minute favor I've read. So sort of the Adam Grant, Wayne Baker, 5-minute favor, help people, and you'll feel like you did something. You mentioned cooking a meal. I think about a student that we had a few years back who was a baker, a great baker, and would often bring in treats to the office. And now I wonder if that was the efficacious piece. So like, I'm going to get something done. I'm going to bake this banana bread, and then I'm going to feel like I've gotten something done, and I can get the next thing that I need to get done in the academic sense done.
Even if it's not conscious, that is the result they're getting. In this study, so this study with students over the midterms, we didn't tell them what to do. So we didn't say go to the gym for 10 minutes or cook a meal. We randomly assigned them to either a compassion or a self-compassion intervention on different days over 10 days. In the compassion intervention, all we said is, people go through difficult times. You will notice someone going through a difficult time today. Do something nice for them, and then tell us what you did. So that in the evening, we surveyed them. And so cooking came up a ton. So that's not something we told students to do. That just seems to be a very common thing that students like to do. Mindfulness meditation came up a lot, which I am impressed by, because when I was a student, that was not a topic that was even on my horizon. But it seemed to really work to hit with that inefficaciousness. And then naps. Naps were a very common response. And what we found is they work great for exhaustion, not so much the others.
So you've sort of talked a little bit, I mean, the compassion piece, it's a little bit like kindness. Mm-hmm. Yesterday, I opened up Tolstoy's Calendar of Wisdom, and at the top of the page, it said, kindness is a necessary addition to everything. And I thought that it was just, since we were going to have this conversation today, I really was struck by that connection. We're pattern matching animals, right? So I saw, there must be meaning here.
I love that.
Let's talk about kindness and how people can bring kindness into the way they interact at work.
Yeah. So that's a rather new subject that we've only been studying for about 20 years. There used to be this assumption that that's a taboo topic in the workplace, right? The work is a very rational realm. We don't talk about such fluffy things. And we've really moved beyond that as business school scholars. We now understand that these topics are incredibly important, not just because we're human beings and we spend the majority of our waking hours at work, but also if you strictly care about a company's bottom line, because kindness has a positive effect on your bottom line. Now, that was a bit of a tangent. Let me get back to kindness. When we study kindness or compassion, we talk about it as a 3-step process. So the organizational definition of compassion is noticing another's pain, feeling empathy, and then doing something about it. And so when I lay it out that way with these 3 steps, you can kind of see why we don't see as much kindness as we would like in a lot of organizations. When I get requests to do interviews, often the question is it because people are sociopaths in the workplace or they don't care about other people, right? Is it something about the kinds of people that go into business that makes them less kind? And our research doesn't support that. Now, there is a little bit of research that links leadership to having less kindness, to sociopathy. But in general, what we find in organizations is you have to meet multiple bars to get to that kindness. You have to notice that someone else in the organization is suffering. That's really difficult when you're distracted by a million other tasks and that person thinks they're not really supposed to be displaying signs of pain because of professional standards in organizations. So often we just don't notice. We don't have that mindfulness component, as you mentioned before. Even if we notice, we may not be close enough to someone in our professional realm to empathize or to understand what they need. And even if we understand what they need, we may just not have the energy or the resources to help them. And so our research looks at how can we have more kindness, and it's really figuring out how to lower the bar on those 3 steps, how to make it easier for people to notice that others around them, their fellow students or their coworkers, are in pain, how to empathize with them, how to get the opportunities or resources to do something about it. I went on a rant there, so you tell me if I answered your question.
Yeah. Well, so this brings me to another thing that I've been thinking about. You know, we're recording this in August of 2021, so we're 18 months or so into pandemic-forced isolation and lockdown, and obviously things opened up a bit this summer, but now things maybe are not opening up as quickly, and we might be backsliding. How much, just if we look at this time period, right, how much has remote work even made it more difficult to be kind, because we are not seeing people in the hallway. We are only seeing people in these, boxes on the screen. There's 5 or 6 or 7 of us, we're here for a meeting, meeting's over, we're gone, next meeting. Have you begun to look at all, or, are you aware of any other researchers looking at how remote work and the pandemic might be affecting that kindness and compassion? And especially when we have this, we layer on top of it, the burnout of, you're never away from work, or you're transitioning from work to home, back to work in, a split second as you get up from your desk and go into the other room and then come back.
Yeah. There's early research on this coming out of various business schools in the US. And my assumption, though these things have not been published yet, the organizational pipeline tends to move quite slowly, is everything that you are assuming is exactly correct. So I think the isolation, the remote work has made it much harder for us to be kind. It's made it much harder for us to hit that first bar, that noticing, right? So I'm looking at you right now in this tiny box. I don't really understand what's going on with your life. You have a green screen on behind you. I'm sorry to the listeners, you don't get the visual, but I don't know what's going on behind you, right? But it could be that your house is a complete mess because you're struggling, and I would never know. So it's been a lot harder. It's also been harder for us to empathize with others when we are barely holding it together ourselves. And so this is certainly not an optimistic take, but I think it has weakened that muscle. I think we also see that in some of the debates outside of organizations, right? So a lot of this masking versus anti-masking, people not treating each other very kindly, I think all of that has atrophied a little. I suppose the silver lining I will offer you is that, like a muscle, I think it'll come back fairly quickly as we come back into organizations, as we interact with each other. Our work also suggests, and this is some unpublished work by Yutze Heng, a PhD student here at Foster, that if you had a closer relationship beforehand, so if you knew someone more intimately before COVID hit, then we can maintain a kind relationship with each other. So this temporary distancing through the camera isn't that big a deal because I know you well enough that I can pick up on your cues. So I think for relationships that were already closer before the pandemic, I think kindness has persisted. For everyone else, it has certainly gone down, but I think we can get it back up once we are through this acute period of confusion.
Do you think that for companies that are going to be doing some type of a hybrid workplace long term, and that those are the companies that our students are probably going into, or maybe it's 3 days a week in the office or a minimum of 2 days a week in the office and work from home or work from anywhere at other times, is it going to be a continued challenge? And are there things that our students and my listeners can think about doing as interventions to try and A, build up that muscle, but B, to, really notice what's going on with the people around them?
I'm actually somewhat optimistic about the future of work. I am quite optimistic about these hybrid models if they come about. And then the reason for that is our prediction is that work really needs different spaces, right? You have to do deep thinking. You have to be in a flow state. And being in a busy open office isn't conducive to that. So allowing employees to do that kind of work in their personal realm and then reserving all the work of working and interacting with each other in those 1 or 2 days when we come to the office, I think will actually make it more likely for compassion or kindness to occur because I'm not as frustrated with you for interrupting my writing time. And I'm really focused on you and noticing you on the days when I come to the office because that's the specific purpose. The one other added benefit that I see of moving towards these flexible designs is, before I mentioned that we found agentic actions were really helpful with burnout. And so having more autonomy and freedom in the days when you're home, taking a nap in the middle of the day without someone judging you for it, recharges your battery, makes you much more enthusiastic or have higher energy for the days when you're going in. So in short, I am quite optimistic about kindness and compassion under one of these flexible work models. I would be concerned if it's a hybrid model where half the employees never come in and half the employees are always in the office. That would make me quite concerned. And I think there we would have to talk about mitigation. But if it's a just more flexible approach to work and doing alone work at home and teamwork in the office, I'm quite optimistic about that.
Are there any other pieces of advice that you have, particularly for a student population, to think about helping their classmates and the people around them if they see people experiencing burnout or the signs of burnout?
Yeah. So again, the problem is that often the signs are hidden, and even more so when we are not in each other's presence, because I can just not show up to class or I can just not turn on my camera. So I think you almost want to look out for the absence of information. Is someone not showing up to things, or are they sitting in class but they don't really seem engaged? That's when you need to reach out. Unfortunately, as a society, we're not really at a point where people are aware of or express their burnout to others. So if you are an empathetic student, you want to help your fellow students, looking for those kinds of things. Students not showing up is much more important than looking for specific symptoms. And then being the one who proactively reaches out and sees how they're doing. This is not organizational research. This is research from psychology. But what psychologists suggest is that when someone's going through a hard time, they're going through a divorce, they've lost a spouse, something like that, it's not a good idea for you to say, if there's anything I can do for you, let me know. Because people who are suffering don't have the energy to even think about what they need or to let you know. And so are there small gestures that you can do to help them or to demonstrate that you care, that don't put the onus on them to tell you? In the management department, we've done a lot of meal trains. So when someone has a kid here or has some sort of other life circumstances, the rest of us organize a meal train where we just show up and we drop off food and we leave. We all love food. You have to know your fellow students or your coworkers a little to understand what they need. But doing those gestures for them rather than saying, if there's anything I can do, let me know, is quite important.
And is there anything that we can do as a community, and this would be similar in any company or on any team, to normalize the conversation around this?
Yeah, I mean, the conversation is normalized when people have a closer or more intimate relationship. So anything you can do to create those closer relationships, not necessarily at a large group level. So not necessarily let's have all 50 of us come into this wellness group, but pairing up people or creating opportunities for people with similar interests to get to know each other one-on-one is the way to do it. At Foster, we have a mentorship program among the faculty. You might know better than me if we're doing similar things with the students, but things like that would be really helpful. Creating activities. So I saw some of the online yoga activities and all that, right? So activities for people who care about similar things to show up and get to know each other. I think creating those interpersonal relationships makes everything else kind of naturally happen. Once I know you, I notice if you're having a tough day, I can do something about it.
Yeah. In the MBA program, we do have a mentor program that students get paired with an outside mentor. And then we also have the Fritzky Leadership Fellows program, where second-year students sort of act as a coach, mentor for first-year students. And then the first-year students are all in learning teams. So they form a fairly close relationship, usually with that fall quarter learning team. And it sounds like that's an opportunity where that intimacy can be created, that psychological safety can be created, where someone might notice if another person is checked out or perhaps doesn't seem like they're doing well, and can then just step in with some small act of kindness.
Yeah. And pulling on that Fritzky chair opportunity for a second, conventionally, we would have said that only helps the mentee, right? And our research suggests actually it helps you both. If you're suffering from burnout, if you're suffering from cynicism, and you are now assigned as a mentor to someone else, it's kind of the best thing to pull you out of your own cynicism. So these are opportunities that benefit both parties. And yeah, that's wonderful.
Well, and then the Foster MBA program has taken home the golden briefcase from the Challenge for Charity yet again. So we do have a very rich tradition of service in the community among the Foster MBAs. So it's another way that students can do something outside of academics that maybe gives them that sense of connection, gives them that feeling of accomplishment and efficacy and helping others.
And I can't stress that enough. I volunteer on Saturdays, like probably the only thing that got me through grad school, right? So people often would think, how do you have time for that? You're so busy with grad school. The last thing you should do is get involved in other organizations or hobbies. I strongly disagree with that. Well, what we find is that can really help recharge you and help with burnout. Have other activities. And if those are activities that help other people, so philanthropic efforts, even better.
So our time together is drawing to a close, and I always ask my guests a couple questions about other resources or books or podcasts that you think if someone wants to dive deeper into this, they would appreciate reading or listening to.
So you already mentioned Adam Grant before, and so I just want to echo any books from Adam Grant. Adam is part of the community of scholars who studies these ideas of meaningful work and of burnout. The one that probably applies the most closely to this research is Give and Take. So if you haven't read Give and Take, I strongly recommend it. Jonathan Haidt's The Happiness Hypothesis is a wonderful resource. I'll give you one out of the blue, kind of non-academic recommendation, and that would be Daily Rituals by Mason Curry. Mason Curry is a historian who compiled the schedules of, there's now 2 books of this, but dozens and dozens of really important scholars, artists, scientists, so Jane Austen, Albert Einstein, and he basically wrote down what their daily lives looked like. And I looked at that for inspiration to see that they're doing a lot of these recommendations that we're making about burnout, right? So do you have a nap scheduled into your day? What does your work look like? So it's not an academic book, but just to get an idea that there isn't one right way to do it. You have to figure out what suits you and to get some inspiration. I really like Daily Rituals.
And I'll put all links to all of these in the show notes for my listeners. I want to thank you so much, Kira, for taking the time to speak with me today and have this conversation on careers and professional life.
Oh, thank you so much. I hope it helped.
This was such an interesting conversation, and I found so much of what Kira shared to be important that it's hard to pick just a few highlights, but I'll try anyway. I really liked how she recommended taking a longer view towards securing your dream job through alternate paths if necessary. The idea that if you're lucky enough to work on something that relates to your passion, it's important to have activities outside of work and outside of that passion that can recharge your batteries. Burnout is more than just feeling tired. It's exhaustion accompanied by feelings of inefficacy and cynicism. And when experiencing burnout, it can be hard for an individual to pull themselves out of it. But small acts of self-care and compassion can help. That to help others, it's better not to ask what you can do for them, just do something for them. As always, visit conversationsoncareers.com for full show notes, including links to the authors and books Kira mentioned. Thank you for listening to another episode of Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. I'd love to hear what you think about the podcast. You can email me at gheller@uw.edu. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or classmate.